Live from my office, as always, sponsored by David Hochberg and Team Hochberg, reminding you, rates are not your friend when the federal government jacks those bad boys up. You know what I'm saying. So here's what you need to do. You need to do what's right for you and get on 56david.com or call 855-56-DAVID. Now, on the website right there, you should get your rate and lock it in as soon as possible. Hochberg and Team Hochberg can talk you through all of this. But we know one thing. We know the Fed is going to raise interest rates at least once or twice this year. Twice is a good call. Could be 3 times. So you're saying, well, when the rates are up, I don't want to pay for something. I want to pay something with a 2 in front of it. Well, if you missed that boat and you're getting a mortgage now, they'll explain what an adjustable rate mortgage is and tell you how fast you can refi. Because as long as your credit's good, you're going to be in a position to do that very quickly. And again, the Hochberg people will talk you through all of it. It's David Hochberg and Team Hochberg, the title sponsors of Live from my office. Remember, rates are not your friend when the interest rates get jacked up, so time is not your friend now. Get a hold of Team Hochberg and lock in a great rate now at 855-56-DAVID or 56david.com. Hi, this is Steve Cochran, and welcome to Live from my office. We're at that point again, that point that none of us ever want to be at, but we're at it again. The point where there has been a mass shooting in a school, and this time again in a rerun of one of the worst days in American history at Newtown. Little children, 2nd to 4th graders, have been murdered just because they were in school. Wrong time, wrong place. That's what school has become far too often. You can't do nothing anymore, and that doesn't just apply to Congress. It applies to all of us, from Columbine to Sandy Hook to now Uvalde. I mean, look at the numbers. In 2021, there were 249 school shootings. This year so far in 2022, there's been 137. We're not at the midway point of the year. I'm recording this on May 26th. We're on pace to far surpass last year's horrific number. And what do we know? Blame solves nothing in politics. Both parties have to own this. That's right, both parties. The incredible dysfunction in the Senate got it really to an epic point when Harry Reid instituted his 60-vote rule. Now, that involves the filibuster and approving judges, and we'll take it up at another time. But Mitch McConnell, being the tiny, small man that he is, made it much worse. And now the point man seems to be the Democratic Senator Joe Manchin, who is very close to Republican in view and more often than not blocks what Biden and the Democrats want to do. By the way, that's not always a bad thing. Now, you might be saying, what can the president do in a case like this? Well, there's groups that are urging Biden to make an emergency declaration on gun violence. That's within the powers of the presidency. An emergency declaration would allow him to do a number of other things that could possibly make a difference. He has said and continues to say he wants Congress to act. Well, we know how that's gone so far. There's also the possibility of naming a gun violence czar. This would be a position that doesn't have to be approved by the Senate, as opposed to the head of the Bureau of Tobacco and Firearms, where we have not had an ATF chief in a number of years. So if the Senate won't approve a new ATF chief, will Congress get in the way of a gun violence czar? And will the public do anything but roll their eyes when they hear that term? Remains to be seen. There are also those who throughout the year have advocated for lifting the Senate filibuster rule, which blocks important pieces of legislation even getting to a vote because the debate is never ended. If necessary, an executive order on background checks for firearm purchases is a possibility. Again, if lawmakers don't pass legislation tightening loopholes in current law, and we'll get to some things on that in a second. Before I go any further, I want to tell you that today's guest is an important one. It's Garry McCarthy, the former head of the Chicago Police Department. And we're going to get the cop's perspective. What is it like to be a policeman now? You know, we've talked about this a lot, but in the city of Chicago, which is where I live, I can give you the most perspective, though things are not drastically different in many major cities around the country, including New York, and for that matter, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and others. But McCarthy, who was a big deal in the New York Police Department, helped turn around the Newark Police Department and ran into a political wall in Chicago. McCarthy will talk about what it's like to be a cop now, talk about guns, talk about violence, talk about police morale and police policies that seem to be making everything worse. Talk about the politics of all of it that make it worse, especially in a city like Chicago, where the mayor's office controls the police department. They get a final vote. And listen, when you listen to McCarthy, he had an interesting conversation with Rahm Emanuel back in the day about how he planned to run things and the handshake agreement that they had until they didn't. And most importantly, McCarthy will talk about what he feels we can do about it coming up on this episode of Live from My Office. It's easy to blame the Republicans, and the Republicans own a lot of this. There are Republicans, however, that are in. They're in on making some sense of gun laws in this country. Roy Blunt from Missouri, who has worked with Patrick Toomey, the outgoing senator in Pennsylvania. Both of them are in. Susan Collins in Maine, she's in for something called a yellow flag law, which supposedly gets around the red flag constitutional rights issue that so many have used to not be able to put their support behind a red flag law. What's a red flag law? A red flag law is about those that are mentally ill or potentially dangerous or domestic violence types and how to keep guns out of their hands. Chuck Grassley, the Republican from Iowa, second in power on the Republican side in the Senate, Grassley supports something called the Eagles Act, named after the mascot at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. We all know what happened there. The Eagles Act would expand the Secret Service's National Threat Assessment Center and have more of an administrative look at how to handle gun violence. That's also where the Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson is. Ron Johnson wants to put up something called a federal clearinghouse on school safety. The problem with Grassley and Johnson's idea is Johnson's is more of a stall. Speed is needed right now. We don't have time for some long-winded government blue ribbon panel to go through this. Action needs to be taken immediately. The Republican from Kansas, Roger Marshall, his office says he supported strengthening background checks before. He will again, along with ways to incentivize families to properly secure their firearms. Mitt Romney, the former presidential candidate, says background checks and upgrading the technology for it is appropriate and a federal responsibility. He looks to support the Toomey-Manchin bill. Toomey and Manchin have taken multiple efforts on this, as again, Toomey is the outgoing senator, which is another reason this Toomey-Manchin effort can't be put on the back burner. But Pat Toomey from Pennsylvania has repeatedly worked on legislation to keep guns out of the hands of known criminals and those who are dangerously mentally ill. Manchin has worked on it as well and said he will again. So there are Republicans who are willing to do something about this. The question is, are there enough of them? Republicans' talking points continue to be it's about mental health, it's not about guns, it's about school security and arming teachers, it's about limiting access to schools, even one-door access on the largest schools, and potentially something technologically called a man trap that would drop down and stop a gunman in a compartment of sorts or block him in a compartment depending on the security at the door. That's a prison description. And while it may become necessary, is that really what we want to do? Set up these schools as prisons? Kids go to school now. They already go to school now with the idea that they have to run drills the way we ran fire drills as kids. Their drills are about staying alive. So in the mental health piece, I don't disagree with that at all. There needs to be more funding on mental health on every level. But it's not enough, and it's not enough to say that's all we need. The other part of the argument is enforce the laws we have on the books. Absolutely. And at a time when too many Democrats, especially progressive Democrats, want reform in regards to the prison population, yeah, okay. But this is another political, you can't have it both ways. In Chicago, gun violators are out on the street way too often the next day after an arrest is made. It can't happen. That's on the Democrats here and Democrats who want jail reform and prison population reform with no consequences. It's not realistic. Another Republican argument, criminals are going to kill anyway, so more laws aren't going to matter. Well, here's the truth. School shootings have not been about criminals. Granted, there are those who have shot up schools and killed innocent people who violated laws to either get their gun or modify their gun. But school shootings are about access to guns, and there's no logical way to argue that point. Gang violence in big cities is not the same thing. Gang violence in big cities, that is about criminals who will do it any way they want to, whether it's drug cartels or other reasons. But let's stop mixing these two. Incredibly disturbed people that shoot up schools and gang criminals in big cities. It's not the same thing. Many Republicans will tell you this is a gateway to taking away your guns. Just stop for a moment. Stop. Think about that sentence. Think about that phrase. You have a Supreme Court that has proven that Republican agenda items are going to get their hearing and very likely could get their vote. There is no reason any logical person could believe that the Supreme Court will take away your gun. It's a ridiculous statement. And then there's it's inconvenient for law-abiding gun owners and citizens. I support the Second Amendment. I support gun ownership. And law-abiding citizens, unfortunately, are going to have to step up and have to jump through a few more loops or hoops to make sure that there's not a loophole that allows another nut to get through. You need an ID to check into a hotel. You need an ID to get a marriage license. You need a driver's license to drive a car. You need an ID most of the time to buy some types of cold medicine. Why shouldn't you have to work harder to get and properly own a gun in a safe manner? Look, it's not the NRA anymore. The NRA and the money the NRA and the gun lobby provides to mostly Republican members of Congress, yeah, the money matters. But the NRA is flat broke. What they do a better job of than most is the messaging. They get the word out that the government is trying to take their guns. That's how the NRA is now staying in business. And Garry McCarthy will address the NRA when we get to that interview in just a couple of minutes. Democrats have ways to negotiate with Republicans on this. It may be distasteful. You may not want to do it, but it needs to be done to potentially save lives. Remember, retail outlets like Walmart and Dick's, companies like Uber, they're demanding action now. This is bad for capitalism. Let's talk about business. Bad for capitalism that this violence is continuing. The fear is real, and it will affect the bottom line. Now, the dirty little secrets continue. There's a Democratic congressman named Steve Israel. He writes in The Hill this week, as former Democratic congressman, that he had a conversation with a Republican in the private members-only elevator after a failed bit of gun legislation after Parkland. He said, and he writes, the Republican admitted that despite personally supporting the bill, he had no choice but to vote against it. In a heavily polarized House where districts were increasingly ruby red versus bright blue, any vote for any gun safety measure would invite a primary opponent to ignite his likely defeat. No issue, he said, motivated his base more intensely than the fear of losing their guns. Moderates would forget that he voted against background checks, but his base would never forget, and he'd be primaried out. Now, you and I can go on all day about a lack of character there and about choosing your stupid job in the House of Representatives over potentially saving the lives of children. But that doesn't solve anything. What we do know from that statement is just a verification of what we feel we've known for a long time, that there's a lot of Republicans who don't want any part of this because they're afraid of losing their job. Gerrymandering is killing people. Gerrymandering is a process of carving up congressional districts in a manner that you are almost certainly going to be able to keep your seat in the House of Representatives and in state politics as well. Both parties are guilty of gerrymandering. Again, I bring you back to Illinois. Democrats and one-party rule as Democrats here have absolutely gerrymandered this state to death. Both parties own it. And gerrymandering has led to the problem of getting anything related to gun bills passed. And what has that created? Apathy amongst voters. Apathy kills. Apathy kills all the time, because if you don't show up in your primary, these primary threats, they will exist in a bigger way and keep people from actually voting their conscience and doing what's right. Because 20% of you on the far right and the far left will show up in primaries, and the other 80% in the middle, and yeah, I do believe it's that high now, the 80% in the middle that don't show up, you have to live with the consequences. You know what else kills is the news cycle. The media has a role to play in this. And the role is not to take one side or the other. The role is to reinforce the facts, inform the public, and to not let it die with the next update from the Johnny Depp trial. And finally, the Senate kills. The 60-vote rule, again, which is detailed and mostly involved the approving of judges and getting judges' seats filled. The 60 votes needed in the Senate means 10 Republicans are needed on any Democrat gun control initiative. There's not 10 Republicans right now, including the people I mentioned at the beginning. 48 Democratic senators, 50 Republicans, but 2 independents that caucus with the Democrats, that means they vote with the Democrats, makes it a 50-50 tie that can always be broken by the vice president. There are solutions here, and they're not impossible, but you have to demand them. And you have to say to your elected representatives, I'm going to show up at the primary, and I'm going to vote for the other guy or the other girl if you don't get behind doing something about this, because I am sick and tired of children dying. Red flag laws, we talked about that. How about high-capacity magazines? You do not need a clip that supports, yeah, look, again, I support the Second Amendment. Sorry, you don't need a clip that supports 20 or more rounds. And the argument here will be, well, there's different definitions of high-capacity magazines. Yeah, there are. And the language and the law can be played with. But every bullet matters. And frankly, red flag laws and high-capacity magazines are the two best ways to limit the carnage. It's not perfect. None of this stuff is perfect. But you could potentially limit the dead count just by instituting those two. Universal background checks is back on the table, prohibiting firearm access for high-risk groups. You know, we still have no-fly zone lists, and people on those no-fly zones lists, they can't fly, but they can get guns. And child access prevention laws need to be in play, because it isn't just about shooting up a school. It's about a little kid getting a hold of a gun in a closet and shooting his brother and sister or his friend. Accidental shootings of children could be reduced immediately, and requiring that guns be stored safely or the people that own them could be prosecuted is a big deal, and it should be a no-brainer. There should be child safety features on every gun. It's outrageous that the Consumer Product Safety Commission can regulate the sale and manufacture of teddy bears or toy guns, but not real guns. And yeah, assault weapons need to be banned. I would fully support, as a Second Amendment supporter, fully support the ability to go to a certified gun range, rent an assault weapon, and use it there, and have all the fun you want. But these are weapons that were built for the military. They have nothing to do with the Second Amendment. There is no way that anybody could take a stand on that and believe it. And finally, research. You got to tackle the gun violence epidemic with facts. You need research to do that. The gun lobby has blocked that to date. That needs to stop. Again, none of this is perfect, but it could save lives. It could limit the carnage. You want to know who your reps are? Go to ballotpedia.org. Put in your zip code. It's an easy site to maneuver, and you can find out who represents you and what they stand for. And vote for people who want this to end and will do something about it. Again, there's a lot of things we can do, but nothing isn't one of them. You got to be involved. You got to take a stand. Coming up, Garry McCarthy, the former superintendent of the Chicago Police Department. We'll come back with that and police perspective on all of this. You're listening to Live from my office. I want to thank Cantini Golf Course once again. Cantini Golf, that's where I love to play. And Matt Tuller, the head pro, sat down with me to give us a few lessons. Now, how do you do a lesson in a podcast, in an audio podcast? How is that good? I can't see it. I got to be able to see it, got to be able to visualize it. The power of your mind in golf is key. It's crucial. I've been having a lot of problems with chipping. I used to be a really good chipper. Now, I'm a really bad chipper. And the head pro at Cantini, Matt Tuller, had some thoughts about this little part of the game which could really make your score a whole lot bigger.
With the chip, we do see some people get the shanks or the yips with their wedge, right? So for me, the one thing that I kind of take a look at is making sure that your weight's on your front foot and that we're rotating through the shot. What we start to see is, just like every shot, you got to remember, there's rotation. And if we don't rotate through the shot, our hands just continue to lead through and we hit the ball with the leading edge, or not leading edge, but the hosel, right? We get those hosel rockets. So to me, it's weight forward and just make sure that we continue to follow through with that swing and have that, I'd like to say, your belly button facing the target in that little follow through.
So it's a mini shot. That's all a chip or a pitch is. It's a mini shot. But it's not your wrists, your hands, your arms. Rotate through. I'm going to go try that as soon as we're done with this podcast, this Live from my office. Cantini Golf, 630-260-8197, 630-260-8197, cantinigolf.com. Well, it's a pleasure to welcome Garry McCarthy back to the podcast. Even though he's playing hurt today, I appreciate you doing this, even though I know you're not feeling well.
Yeah, that's fine, Steve. Just gotta power through it. You know?
That's it. All right, it'd take me an hour and a half to go through your resume, but here's the brief. Became a New York City cop at 22, rose through the ranks, become deputy commander of ops in 2000, on the ground on 9/11, and very closely working with then Mayor Giuliani. Survived, so many of your friends and colleagues not survive on that horrific day. You leave the New York City Police Force 2006. Cory Booker hires you to run the Newark department. It's impossible to argue with your success in cleaning up Newark, and eventually come here in 2011 into the political quagmire that is Chicago, and trying to run the police department here. And now the interim police chief at Willow Springs. You and I haven't talked about this, but I love the fact that you're helping out the people of Willow Springs, because you're not sitting on the sideline. You're doing something. And so many of us just sit and bitch as opposed to stepping up.
Yeah. And you know what? That's a good part of half the reason why I'm doing this. It's giving me a voice again, which, you know, you don't even have to ask me what I think. You kind of know that, but
right.
It's given me a voice, and somebody's got to start, you know, speaking truth to power, because nobody's doing it. And, you know, it's time to declare failure and move on. You know, this agenda, the anti-police agenda, which, you know, it's kind of akin to holding the police responsible for 400 years of racism and segregation
right.
in this country.
Right.
And, you know, the police are the tip of the spear, if you will. And, you know, this has more to do with our government than it does policing. And at the end of the day, you know, it's not working. You look at what's happening across the country. All the major cities across the country are having problems. At least, well, I'm sure there's some that aren't having the same.
But it's impossible.
Like Chicago.
It's impossible not to believe that your town is next. You know, this is not America. Yeah. This is not where we should be, where you're afraid to send your kids to school. You know, you thank God and drop to your knees and say a prayer that they came home safely, that you're worried about going to the mall or whatever. The cowardice in politics has never been deeper, and the fact that they say the stuff out loud they used to say behind closed doors is an absolute reprehensible time in this country, and they ought to be held to account. But you got to get off your ass, and you got to show up in primaries June 28th in Illinois. You don't get to bitch on Election Day and say, how did we end up with these two if you don't show up? And what do we know, Garry McCarthy? We know that 20% of people vote in the primaries.
Yeah.
If we're lucky, by the way.
Yeah, I was going to say if we're lucky, because, and I think the numbers go something like this. In Chicago, only 30% of the population is actually registered to vote, or somewhere around a third. And out of that third, only a third of them actually come out and vote. And that's what happened in the last mayoral election. I was astounded with the lack of interest in probably the most important election that Chicago's had in 65 years.
Right.
Because it was run by the Dailies and then Rahm Emanuel, with some folks in between, Jane Byrne and so on. But at the end of the day, it was an absolute opportunity for the city to kind of break out and go in the right direction. And just look at what's happened.
Well,
nobody can claim success here.
They're right. There isn't any. And here's the deal. This isn't about blaming people and pointing fingers at people. This is about factually stating where failures of power are happening and why things have to change. Crime is not, this better than anybody. Crime is not a social experiment. Are there people in jail that shouldn't be there or have been sentenced too long and can't get a lawyer to get them out? Absolutely. But the idea that you can commit a gun crime in Chicago and be back on the street the next day is just appalling.
Yeah, but Steve, it's a bastardization of good theories, right? And the theory of mass incarceration, people might agree with it or disagree with it. The bottom line is mass incarceration has a lot to do with the drug laws. And quite frankly, people might be surprised to hear me say this, but, narcotics is a social problem, and it's been criminalized, right? And granted, it does terrible things. Does absolutely terrible things. And I will tell you this, I've never met a burglar who was not a heroin junkie. That's how they get their money to go buy heroin. But at the end of the day, putting that burglar in jail for burglary is not going to fix his heroin problem. He's going to come out and do the same thing over and over again. So it has to do with the narcotics laws and also indigent individuals who cannot post bond and so on and so forth. That doesn't mean that you flip over the table and you throw out the entire criminal justice system, because gun crimes are not about mass incarceration, period. And that's where it's been bastardized, and it's a valid theory that's just been flipped over, and we're paying the price for it across the country right now.
Yeah, and you cannot wake up in this country. By the way, we're recording this on May 25th. Depending on when you hear this, this is May 25th, the day after Uvalde, Texas, which was Newtown plus more of little kids being murdered when a lunatic comes into a classroom, barricades the door, shoots up the entire place before a border agent, a special ops agent of sorts, was able to take him out. How many of these have to happen? I thought Newtown to me was the worst day in America since 9/11, and nothing happened. And now we have this.
I actually heard some very intelligent conversation on the news this morning where, to his credit, Larry Potash was speaking to a security expert and talking about the gun laws and so on. And, they were talking about the NRA. And they were talking about the fact that the NRA was created for gun safety back in the day.
Right.
And, I was an NRA member as a kid because my dad was a Marine and a police officer, and we actually were in the Boy Scouts on a rifle team that placed nationally. And the NRA was about gun safety. What's happened is the gun manufacturers, and this was from Newtown. I want to give credit where credit is due. And President Obama, who, I met with a number of times, I had wonderful conversations with him, but it seems like nothing ever happened from it. But President Obama tried to introduce bills or laws that were going to prevent people who had mental issues,
right,
people who were terrorists or have criminal backgrounds from buying guns. How crazy does that sound? Why would we ever want to do that? And the polling at the time, and obviously I don't really trust polling as a 100% measure of how people think. Polling at the time said something to the effect of 85% of Americans and something like 70% of NRA members thought that it was a good idea. But it didn't even get off the Senate floor because it got blocked by the senators who are getting money from the special interests, which includes the NRA and the gun manufacturers,
Right.
not to change the laws. And the gun manufacturers are filling up the legal and illegal market for firearms in this country, making billions of dollars with a B, and Americans are dying as a result. It was the most outrageous thing that I've ever seen in my law enforcement career, and that eclipses 9/11 because these are Americans who are allowing Americans to die based upon special interest and money and big business. And it's just not supposed to be like that anymore.
No, and it's
we had those problems back in the day,
right?
And we thought that we were fixing them, and we haven't.
And it's literally in our power to be able to change the people who refuse to deal with this on any given level. So let me take it to Chicago. You know the Chicago Police Department. You ran it. Lori Lightfoot came in as mayor. And when she came in as mayor, I will grant you this. She was dealt a bad hand because nobody saw COVID coming. But Lori Lightfoot has been her own worst enemy. And the fact that the Chicago Police Department is under the mayor's office is a problem that, in my mind, and correct me if you disagree, it's never been amplified more than during this period of time. True?
Yeah, I believe that. I absolutely believe that. And Steve, I could give you example after example of policies that are coming right out of City Hall. And the clearest one to me was the unfortunate, terrible Adam Toledo shooting.
Right.
Adam Toledo was the 13-year-old who was on the street with a gangbanger at 2 o'clock in the morning on a school night. And the gangbanger was firing his gun at somebody. It was picked up on ShotSpotter and video. He ends up, and what the gang members do is they call these young kids shorties, and the shorties carry the guns for them because 13-year-old is less likely. Not that anybody goes to jail for gun possession in Cook County anyway,
right?
But the shorty is less likely to go to jail. He gives the gun to Adam Toledo, who runs from the police, turns at the last second and gets shot. And the officer fired one shot and he killed him. The fallout from that terrible incident was not trying to figure out how to keep 13-year-olds off the street at 2 a.m., keeping them away from gangbangers, keeping them from holding on to guns for gangbangers. The fallout from that was a foot pursuit policy and a movement to get rid of ShotSpotter. Now, ShotSpotter is an acoustic method of picking up gunshots.
Right.
And it's proven to be very successful across the country. I implemented it when we were in Newark. And what I found was we were going to shots fired jobs where people did not call 911 and making arrests as a result. It is an absolute great tool for law enforcement. But now instead, we've got a foot pursuit policy, which in sum and substance says you cannot chase anybody because you have to ask for a supervisor's permission. And you have to have probable cause, which means the person is arrestable right now. You don't know what you don't know.
Of course not.
That person might have just committed a murder. So the whole premise of that is just wrong-headed. But those are policies that are being dictated by politicians. The Police Reform Act, signed by the governor, has something to do with bail reform. What does that have to do with the police?
Right.
Absolutely nothing. And then they're wringing their hands in Springfield saying, what are we going to do about carjackings? We have to pass a law. I got an idea. Start repealing the stupid laws that you've put into practice already.
Right. You're right. Clean the system up that's created the problem where people know that they can come into the loop, into the near north side, and commit any crime they want. Commit any crime they want. And there's almost no chance they'll be arrested, and if they are, they'll get bounced in 24 hours.
You know, I was on the news the other night, and the subject was talking about police policies across the country, but particularly here in Chicago. And they wanted to talk about the pursuit policy because the young man who got shot and fortunately is surviving in Lincoln Park.
Right.
that terrible video that we've all seen. Apparently, the police actually had that car an hour before, and it took off on them, and they didn't chase it. And they wanted to talk about the pursuit policy, which, the policy itself is way too much. It's 13 pages long. And you can boil a pursuit policy down to one sentence. It's real simple. Does the danger of the pursuit outweigh the danger of the individual escaping?
Right.
It's that simple.
Right.
It's really that simple. So you take into consideration factors like, what time of day is it? Is it rush hour? Are you on Randolph and State Street where there's thousands of people crossing the street, or is it 2:00, 4:00 in the morning in a deserted neighborhood where people actually go to bed at night, like Lincoln Park? So those are all considerations that you're supposed to take into account. But when I got to speak, which sometimes, as you know, is difficult to do with television, I said, this is less about the policies and more about the police thinking about their own self-defense. In other words, it's easier to do nothing than to get involved, because look at the young officer whose name I'm not going to mention, who shot out of Toledo.
Yep.
He's been called a murderer.
Right.
The kid had a gun and turned on him, and he couldn't see that the kid dropped the gun. He's not supposed to wait to get shot, but he's called a murderer. So do you want to go through that, or do you want to just let this car drive away? And these guys let the car drive away. And in this instance, there was a terrible fallout from not pursuing that vehicle. This poor young man is going to be changed for the rest of his life. And there was a couple of other crimes that happened in between the non-pursuit and the shooting of that young man. So that's the fallout. And the officers are better off not doing something in their own mind, which I don't necessarily agree with. I've always been a very active police officer. But I got off the air, and 15 minutes later, unfortunately, we shot that 13-year-old kid who was unarmed in the gas station after the carjacking.
Yep.
After a different carjacking. So the point is, we've created this landscape in this country with this anti-police movement and holding the police accountable, hamstringing the police, and empowering criminals all at the same time. What did you think was going to happen?
Yeah, the environment we live in now makes it harder to keep kids safe because politicians are trying to make sure their jobs are safe.
Correct.
And talk to me about the police point you just brought up a second ago, because I believe the majority of cops are of the same mindset as you. You don't go and become a cop in a city the size of Chicago, well, in any city. You don't go and become a cop with the idea that you don't want to do the job. There are certainly people in any walk of life who phone it in. But a cop who phones it in is going to be exposed very quickly and hopefully dealt with, and they'll be looking for a new line of work. So what does it do? We talk about morale related to criminals being arrested and being released the next day, but what does it do to morale in the police force when your better option is to not pursue or not arrest?
Well, I speak to police officers in Chicago all the time. I have a number of people who have befriended me, who are police officers right up the ranks in CPD, who still speak to me, reach out to me on my phone, text me, whatever, all the time. And it not only is morale in the toilet, but they're afraid to get caught up in the politics, because this administration has literally, I'm trying to think of the right word, I almost cursed, has literally
It's a podcast. You can say anything you want.
Literally dumped some of the smartest, hardest working executives in the department based on nonsense. Somebody said something about the mayor at a golf outing, and that person got sent to Bogeyland, and he ended up retiring. And he was one of the best guys in the department.
Yeah, it's just outrageous.
Yeah, and the police officers see this because those great leaders are being cast aside all at the same time in the name of progressive, in the name of a progressive movement that, like I said, is just failure. I went to the police recognition ceremony yesterday at the Hyatt downtown, and these officers are just crestfallen. They are just crestfallen. They want to talk about taking care of the officers, right? This is what we hear all the time. They're talking about their mental health and so on and so forth. But they make them work for 29 days straight.
Right.
That's not helping. I mean, a lot of guys and women love to do overtime because you make time and a half, and it's good for your family that you can make the money, but it's also bad for your family when you're just not there. So morale in the department is at probably an all-time low. I mean, obviously, I've only been here for 11 years, and at some point, I'm sure I'm going to be accepted in Chicago, but only 11 years at this point. So I don't know exactly how far back we have to go to find something this bad.
Well, we do know that there is more gun violence in Chicago since the record-setting numbers in the early 90s. We're talking about 30-year high numbers, and more deadly violence than just about any other time in history. So where is the flow?
And that's with better healthcare, Steve. That's with better healthcare.
100%.
Yeah.
So if you took triage out of this and the ability to save lives, you can't imagine what those numbers would be. So look, we have very strict laws in Cook County and Chicago about guns, but the flow of illegal guns has probably never been higher. Where are they coming from? I hear Mississippi and Indiana. Is that the main flow?
Yeah, and the other one is Wisconsin. There's 3 places that the guns come from in Chicago, for probably something like 65%. I forget the actual number. Mississippi, and that has to do with the Great Migration back in the 50s. People still have family down in Mississippi, and they go down and visit, and they come back up with guns. Happens all the time. That's one place. Indiana and Wisconsin have more lax laws as far as the purchase of guns. And those are number 2 and 3, where the guns come from in Illinois. Now, having said that, Steve, that hasn't changed since I was superintendent. That hasn't changed at all. The difference is there's 100% more murders now because we're depolicing. We're not doing the things that we know work. And it's really disturbing the way that, we talked about the bastardization of mass incarceration, the misunderstanding of it. And it's the same thing with the quote-unquote stop and frisk. I have never seen a police department in the country that has a stop and frisk policy. It's called, they are called Terry stops. And the Supreme Court held in Terry versus Ohio, a 1968 landmark case in policing, that where appropriate, the police can frisk people. Now, if they're doing it inappropriately, that's called stop and frisk, right? Because you just stop somebody and frisk them. You have to get from mere suspicion to reasonable suspicion, which is a different standard in the law, and then you can actually put your hands on somebody to provide for your own safety. And I got to tell you, I've never seen a person, and I was a very active officer when I was a young cop in the Bronx. Old timers didn't like working with me because things would just happen in front of me, and they said that my initials stood for gun magnet, not Garry McCarthy. And I've literally made hundreds of gun arrests. Not one person ever jumped into the back of my car and said, "I have a gun, arrest me."
Right.
You have to get out of the car and go get it.
Well,
we've put these officers.
It doesn't quite work that way, does it?
No. There was one incident that I was involved in where a guy did a robbery, and he basically said, "Well, if you do the crime, you got to do the time." Okay. That was the only time a criminal ever said that to me, out of hundreds and hundreds of arrests. But the bottom line is we've created an environment where the officers are not getting out of the cars. We were on the verge of breaking 400 murders in 2013 and 2014,
right,
going down, which were 1965 murder rates. You know what? That's not that long ago. And last year, we had 800 murders. And I know the number is 797. I don't believe that, quite frankly.
Yeah,
because that was the number that they gave at midnight on January 1st. But here's how the rules go. If somebody gets shot in October, November, December, and they die, that number goes backwards. That number of 797 has not changed since 2,400 hours on December 31st. So there's no way that's the case.
Well, and you know this better than anybody because you helped bring technology and analytics to the Chicago Police Department like nobody had before. This is part and parcel of the problem of the mayor's office running the police department. Decisions on statistical counting are being made by politicians whose goal is to look as good as they can to the public to try to get voted or try to get votes so they stay in the job. I mean, that just in and of itself should be an argument to change the way we do things.
Yeah, and you know what? Some people don't have the audacity to stand up to their bosses.
Right.
And, obviously I have my issues with Rahm Emanuel. I mean, he gave me the greatest opportunity, and then, he basically left me without a job and a method to support my family. So, going from the top of the heap to the bottom like that was a pretty big issue for me. But when I took this job, when I took the Chicago superintendent job, the first tenet of my taking the job was I had three tenets. This was the first one. I'm really going to run the police department. I will keep your politics in mind, but I'm really going to run the department the way it should be run.
Right.
And you know what? To his credit, he agreed to it. I had to argue with him constantly, but 99.9% of the time, I did what I wanted to do. There was that small percentage where I did something that was going to help his politics, and I could have done something different. But we actually had arguments about whether or not something was a murder or not. And I'm trying to explain to him that it's not up to me and it's not up to him. It's up to the Uniform Crime Report at the time, and now we're using something which is better called NIBRS. But it lays out very specifically what's a murder. And, I mean, I had this argument back in New York with different politicians at the same time, and it's a natural thing because people, they want to become experts in policing. Everybody knows how to police better than the police.
And not a single one has ever made an arrest or put their life on the line.
Do people tell doctors how to operate?
No, of course
when
not.
When comes to your house, do you lean over his shoulder and say you got to use a wrench on that?
I think I've used this analogy with you before. I don't get on a plane, knock on the cockpit door, and go, "Hey, I watched a YouTube video. I'll take it from here." It's insane.
Yeah, but that's the nature of policing in the first place. But with people who don't have the audacity to stand up and do the right thing and demand that we don't implement policies based upon politics. We do it based upon the law and what's right to get our job done. We lose. And I see that in a lot of places across the country right now. And I know most of the folks across the country because I was a member of the Major City Chiefs Association for 10 years, and I'm a lifetime member, and I was the vice president for a couple of years. And the nature of policing today has changed dramatically. And unfortunately, guys and women across the country want to keep their jobs. And, they're kowtowing to the politics to make that happen.
All right. So, and I appreciate all the time, and I know we're going to run out of time, but let me just run a few things by you here because I've learned a lot in our many conversations about things that I thought were right that weren't, and things that I hope were wrong that turned out were right when it comes to perception. I back the police because I believe you deserve credit the same way men and women who serve and fight wars for us or stand by to do the same do as well. It's never been harder to be a cop in my lifetime when everybody has a phone and editing software and can make any arrest look any way they want it to look, and the media is ready to gobble it up and show it over and over and over again. So how do we move forward? And by the way, I'm not done with naming politicians, but how do we move forward in that environment when in the city of Chicago, I believe we're 1,100 cops short of the need as it's understood right now, and we're going into summer?
Yeah, it's not a crime strategy to cancel days off, but unfortunately that's what we've reached. And I don't really see a strategy. And I've spoken to officers and I've spoken to bosses. And one of the retired bosses who I saw yesterday said to me, he said, you know what you did all the time is you would go out on the street and you would work with the cops and you would talk to them and you would ask them about the plan. He says, I was a district commander, and it came back to me that, you're out there at 2:00 in the morning on a Saturday talking to officers on street corners and asking them about, what's your direction from your bosses and what's the plan. And I was so gratified to hear that.
Right.
because that's what I did. And it wasn't really a quiz. It was just, hey, what are you guys doing? Why are you doing it? And they were able to explain and articulate it to me. When I speak to officers today, they say there's no plan. There's only policies. There's no plan. There's only policies. So we have to have a crime strategy. We have to have a plan. And what's really troubling to me, Steve, is we wrote it down. The plan was immortalized in something called the Chicago Plan back in the day in 2013 and 14 when we were doing so well. And we were doing it under the same laws that are in vogue today, but not the same policies, because here's something that I find incredibly troubling. Accreditation. Police departments get accredited by the Department of Justice. And what happens is they come in and they help you make your policies be the gold standard for policies in policing across the country. They look at everything that you're doing. It's a real rigorous process. Well, I started the process of accreditation for the Chicago Police Department, which says that you've got all your ducks in a row. They completed it like 2 years ago, I think. And guess what? They're still under a consent decree, which is implementing policies that go way beyond the accreditation process. So it just doesn't make sense. Now, what's the point of going through this process of accreditation if you're going to have a consent decree with somebody who comes in, a monitor who is the sole person who decides when you're in compliance, right? And they want to keep their job because they're making a lot of money by doing this.
Well,
so they keep coming up, moving the goalposts.
Right.
Moving the goalposts.
To me, it goes all the way back to something you said at the beginning. And we've had discussions about this with the military where somebody at the Pentagon is making a decision on whether or not a sniper should open fire in the Middle East when an officer on the street with collective experience of he or she and their partner is ready to move and they have to get clearance by radio from someone not there. This sort of quagmire, it's got to make it impossible.
Sure. Well, it's funny, though. You mentioned the military and you mentioned having respect for the military. One of the lines that has stuck with me through the years. Years ago, there was a commandant in the Marine Corps named James Jones. Obviously, I remember his name for a couple of reasons. But I was at a luncheon where he spoke, and he said, "You know what?" He said, "We basically do the same things." He says, "Law enforcement and the military." He says, "We play the away games and you play the home games." And nothing that I've heard could be more true. And if you go back decades, if you go back hundreds of years, look at, the struggles that military commanders have had with politicians, whether it was McClellan and Lincoln or MacArthur and Truman or Westmoreland and Lyndon Johnson and Nixon.
Right.
So, it's the same exact dynamic, and we haven't learned from it. We just, what's insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And that's what we're doing.
And that's why we're in this mess, and there's no way out unless we accept that fact and deal with it, because this is fixable, but it takes courage and participation. Yeah. The state's attorney is Kim Foxx. Kim Foxx has taken a lot of grief about being the head of this problem of turning people back on the street. But there's also a chief judge in Cook County named Tim Evans, who has instituted a policy which can allow murderers to go home on electronic monitoring, or accused murderers to go home on electronic monitoring. How big are they in this problem?
Yeah, well, that's really the point that I tried to bring out before, is that, the police are only the tip of the spear. There's a theory that has to do with the fact that in the disenfranchised neighborhoods, the populace feels that the system, the government system, is uncaring, unwilling, and unable to provide for the public safety. And who is it that goes into their living rooms when they call 911 because there's a disturbance? It's the police. So they only look at the police. They don't look at who's behind it. They don't look at the politicians who are making these policies and hamstringing the police while encouraging crime. They don't look at the elected officials who, might be state's attorneys or elected judges or appointed judges who are making these policies at the same time. They don't look at the correction system that is looking, that's being overseen by Cook County, who, and Tony Preckwinkle holds the purse strings for Kim Fox,
Yep.
the Tom Dart over the correction system and the judiciary. So she is controlling the criminal justice system. Why isn't she being held to account for what's going on here?
No, it's exactly
Why
right.
Why is it that when somebody gets out on electronic monitoring and they run over a child because they're in a stolen vehicle running from a robbery, why aren't they being held to account for this? Because they want to empty out the jails, they want to save money, and this is all part of the policy of anti-police that we're dealing with in this country. I don't understand.
Tony Preckwinkle makes it much harder to be Tom Dart on a day-to-day basis, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So,
and probably even Kim Fox and Tom Dart.
Well, Kim Fox, and Tim Evans.
She's a puppet.
Kim Fox and Tim Evans both need to answer for the actions they've taken and the actions they haven't, and I don't believe they have in either case, and they're not going anywhere anytime soon. But again, public involvement is the absolute key here. So if can we generally agree that what we know is this, that when you see this horrific school shooting that we saw in Texas, there are legally purchased guns in this country that are being used in these sorts of crimes, and it's a horrible, awful, terrible thing that, and again, it goes counter to what we talked about earlier, but it seems to me that a change in red flag laws and an ability to hold social media accountable for those sorts of problems before the worst thing happens would help. Is that crazy?
No, it's not crazy. It's not crazy. But how do you hold social media accountable? Because, free speech. People could say what the heck they want, even if it is inflammatory. One of the things that I said during the NATO summit, I mentioned it before. My dad was a World War II Marine. He was at American Samoa, Guadalcanal, New Guinea, New Britain, Iwo Jima, and the occupation of Japan as a machine gunner. He got shot 3 times. He got blown up a whole bunch of times. 44 guys landed in his platoon on Iwo Jima. 2 walked off the island unwounded. And my dad was not one of them. This guy was my country, right or wrong. And to a very strong degree, that has been ingrained in me. And I said during the NATO summit that I will protect the First Amendment for these people who are coming to Chicago, but I will be intolerant of criminal behavior. So if you want to burn a flag, I guess it's your right. It's been held that it's a First Amendment free speech right. It doesn't mean I agree with it, but I'm not going to tolerate the criminal behavior. We have to get to that point again. We have to have that thought process that 100%. We are intolerant of crime, period.
Right. Look, I grew up around a lot of really bad white people. I don't care if you're black, white, brown. Yeah. A crime is a crime. And there are short-term, medium-term, and long-term solutions to every problem. Correct. The long-term solution is to give communities that are suffering an opportunity to have kids have other choices they can make in their lives. But here's the sad fact. That's not going to happen by this weekend or next weekend or the weekend after that. So what are we going to do right now? You're going to give the police the ability to take criminals off the street because, again, I don't care what color you are. Crime is crime.
You need a crime plan. And what nobody talks about is the racial makeup of victimization. And in the city of Chicago, it's about 85% of the victims of gun violence are African American.
Right.
So, and by the way, the offender data is pretty much online with the victimization data. It's the same numbers. So, you have to put more police in the neighborhoods where that happens, which means more interactions, which means more arrests, which means that people accuse us of being racist. So it's a no-win situation in the environment that we're in right now. We have to speak truth to power, and nobody out there is doing it.
In regards to the illegal guns, and I promise I'll let you go on this, but I've asked again and again, going back to Governor Rauner, as a matter of fact, because, again, I don't care what party you're a part of either. Why aren't you calling for a summit? Why aren't you using the power you have as the governor of one of the largest states in America and say to the governors of Indiana, Mississippi, and Wisconsin, you know the illegal guns in Chicago are coming from your states. That's bad for us, but it's also bad for you. So we're going to do a summit together on how we're going to stop this and how we're going to work together to stop this, regardless of party. Or I'm going to call you out publicly and say that you're not willing to do it. Why couldn't we have that?
We should, but nobody's willing to call anybody out. I really see this over and over again. The only time you see it is in political ads at this time when people are running for office. That's when all of a sudden all these things come out about different people. But, until such time, you're going to have governors signing bills, like for instance, the bill that was signed here in Illinois on the very day that the lead news story was that all these carjackings that we're dealing with are being committed by teens, by children who are not adults. On that very day, Governor Pritzker signed a bill limiting the police ability to interview those prisoners who might not be adults.
Right.
On the same day.
Right.
So talk about tone deaf. I don't even know what to say sometimes.
Well, I started this return to radio on WLS a bit ago with an essential premise that I think you believe in, and I do for certain, and that is that as bad as things are, with all the terrible problems we have, the problems we have because we're in America are fixable. Everything doesn't suck. Everything doesn't suck. And in the rest of the world, these problems would not be addressable, and they're not addressable. But people have to get off their asses and get involved in the process again. I get that you're beaten down. I get that you don't believe you can make a change. But if you don't get involved, how do you think it's going to change? It won't.
Well, from the day that I turned eligible to vote, I have voted in every election that I could, every single one. And, that goes back to my parents. That's the way I was raised. They were that greatest generation. Went through the Depression, went through World War II, came back to America, thinking that this is the way life is supposed to be, and they certainly imbued that in myself and my two older brothers. But not everybody agrees with that.
I would encourage you to go back and listen to the conversations Garry McCarthy and I have had before that are on the podcast stream, including a conversation we had about that day on 9/11, which I've probably got more comments on live from my office than just about any other guest we've ever had. But I respect what you've done and what you continue to try to do. And to the good people of Willow Springs, I'm glad they've got you for however long you choose to do that. And good luck with the consultancy as you continue along that road as well. Now stop talking to people and go take care of yourself.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna. Well, I still, what's a little troubling is I have to do 120 hours to get recertified as a police officer because I was not a police officer for more than 3 years.
How about that?
And it's mind numbing.
How about that?
To have to go through this. Yeah, 35 years of policing at the highest levels in the country, and I'm doing this. But hey, it is what it is. That's okay. Training, very important.
Well, you know what?
So I'm gonna go home and grab my laptop and get moving.
But you know what? In a weird way, and it's easy for me to say because I don't have to sit there and try to stay awake while you're doing it. It does my heart good to know that that's what it takes to continue to be a cop on some level.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm agreeing reluctantly.
Yeah, I get it. Garry McCarthy, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Hope you feel better soon, but thanks for the education, and let's all get involved and stay involved.
Always a pleasure, Steve. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
I can't thank David Hochberg enough for the continued support of Live from My Office as our title sponsor. And the David Hochberg words of the day are credit utilization. Ooh. What's credit utilization? I don't know, but he knows. Actually, I do know. Credit utilization is the amount of credit debt you have out there and how you're using it and how you're paying it down. Now, that's as basic a definition as I can give you because I looked it up a few minutes ago, and that seems right. David Hochberg knows all the terms related to your credit score and making sure your credit rating is great to make sure you get the best terms whenever you go ahead and do a loan of any kind. He's got the experts. He's got a guy. He's got several guys and ladies too, and they're all teed up to help you. David Hochberg and Team Hochberg can save you money in so many ways, but you have to ask for the help, and they will step up and give it to you. 855-56-DAVID, 56david.com. Remember, credit utilization, it matters. Okay, I want to thank the former superintendent of the Chicago Police Department, Garry McCarthy, for joining me to talk about it. He was feeling a lot worse than he let on there, and hope you feel better soon. Thanks for being a part of Live from My Office, and I hope people were inspired by what you had to say. Let's talk about the charity worth mentioning here. Imagine the pain of losing your child to gun violence. I hope you never, ever, ever have to go through that. I hope I never, ever, ever have to go through that. And it hurts my heart every time I think, not just about those innocent kids, but about the families they leave behind who've all been changed by this, because the rest of us get to move on. Don't we owe it to them to do something about this? And by the way, if you don't want to contact your elected reps, if you feel like it's not something you can do, you're too uncomfortable with that, well, you could help an organization that's trying to help every day and have been doing it for over 10 years. It's Sandy Hook Promise. Sandy Hook Promise is a 5-star rated charity built and operated by the people affected most by the nightmare that happened in Newtown. And you can do a lot. Check out their website, give however you can, and know that it is 5-star rated at Charity Navigator, and your donation will make a huge difference. sandyhookpromise.org. That's sandyhookpromise.org. I mentioned Ballotpedia. The state primary calendar is in the show notes. Check out the show notes for a lot of things, if not everything, related to these episodes. And you can go to ballotpedia.org, like Wikipedia, but it's Ballotpedia, ballotpedia.org, and check out everything related to your state primary. And again, you got to vote. You got to vote. There's still time in most states. June is a very busy month for primaries. Please be involved. Step up and be involved. Before we go, also, don't forget you can subscribe, rate, and review every one of these Live from My Office podcasts. There will be no Deep Six this week. I want to congratulate my partner, Patty Steele, on the Deep Six. Patty Steele just won a Gracie Award, which recognizes excellence in women in media. And she's in Los Angeles this week to accept that. We will have a brand new Deep Six for you next week, and I look forward to bringing that to you then. Finally, before we go, thank you, Ross Cochran. I don't know if I thanked Ross, so maybe I'm thanking him a second time. But thank you, Ross, for putting this all together. My son is a dad himself, and I know how he worries about his kids the same way that I worry about his kids, my grandchildren. This has to stop, and it can stop. Remember, there is no perfect solution. Don't buy into the arguments. Force the elected representatives we have to do their jobs through the power of your vote, and vote in your primaries. There's a whole lot of things we can do. Nothing isn't one of them. Thanks for listening. I'm Steve Cochran, and this is Live from My Office.
Thank you for listening to Live from My Office, a service of Monkey Run Productions. All rights reserved. The podcast is hosted by Steve Cochran, and it's mixed, edited, and produced by me, Ross Cochran. Steve is available for corporate speaking gigs. He would love to MC your event, and occasionally, he's funny. Thank you for listening. Head to cochranshow.com